Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it, and thank you to our witnesses today for providing us some insights into this growing problem of cyber security. I come from the private sector. I've been operating in the private sector my entire career, so I'd like to chat a little bit about China and the United States private sector. And while most of my questions would be toward Mr. Painter from the State Department, anyone else feel free to jump in. Mr. Painter, the State Department's Overseas Security Advisory Council, OSAC, recently concluded that despite media's reporting that Chinese cyber attacks are decreasing, cases of Chinese espionage campaigns against the U.S. private sector are ongoing. Which sectors, Mr. Painter, do you think are most at risk for these Chinese cyber attacks?
Look, I think the DNI has talked about this, and we continue to see intrusions into systems, both government systems and private sector systems, for espionage purposes. What we agreed to with China, which was significant, is that they would not break into private sector systems to steal intellectual property or trade secrets or business proprietary information for the purposes of benefiting their commercial sector. On that, we've been pushing them very hard. There's a number of ways we've been doing that. It was really a remarkable fact that they came to that agreement when President Xi was here, and we said we're going to hold them accountable. We're still going to use all the tools that we have, and the jury is still out. I think Admiral Rogers recently testified saying we are watching closely, but the jury is still out.
Any other comments on that question?
Again, I left government on May 9th of this year, but up until that point, I would concur with what Chris has just said. Having been the office that was charged with making those determinations on behalf of the U.S. government, the jury is still out, or it was as of May 9th. And I will just offer two other considerations that one has to think about is, and I mentioned this in my written statement, modus operandi may change, so behavioral patterns may change, and the question of volume or quantity versus rate of success and quality of foreign activities is something that needs to be considered. So I would recommend that if that is an issue that is of interest to you, sir, that's probably better for closed hearings with my colleagues or others from the intelligence agencies in the future, but asking what the current impacts are and what, if anything, has changed and metrics, that kind of attribution analysis is very, very difficult, and you quickly get into classified discussions. But it's a worthwhile question and one we grappled with for my 5 years at ODNI.
Mr. Singer.
If I understood your question, it was, in essence, who's being targeted, and it's a confluence of two factors. It's one, what are their national priorities for economic success? To put another way, what industries do they want to be global leaders? And those are industries that have been most targeted for intellectual property theft in the past. The agreement may change that. And the second is vulnerabilities. Where are the weak links and who are they able to get into? And that again points to the value of a resilience-based strategy where it's effective, be it against the threat of intellectual property theft to the threat from cyber terrorists to China in a military means. Good defense actually is good defense.
Well, Mr. Painter.
And I would certainly agree with the hardening the target issue, which we've raised a number of times. But I also say it's not just the U.S. So one of the important things is a lot of other countries have raised this concern. The UK has raised it, Germany has raised it, and others. And the G20 statement that I talked about, where there was an affirmation among the leaders of the G20 that this conduct was impermissible, I think is also important. It sets a metric that we can hold people accountable by.
Relative to China, and since we're talking about cyber attacks in the private sector, one would think the reason for China doing this would be economic. But is there any military reason China would be attacking our private sector? Maybe Mr. Hughes would have some insights into this. Or what are your thoughts? Are these attacks, cyber attacks, mainly private sector economic, or are they also military?
I think they're probably targeting our private sector companies to enhance their national security apparatus as well. I'm sure that some of our defense industrial-based companies are being targeted by the Chinese to benefit their military development and advancement of their technologies.
Mr. Painter, any other insights on that?
No, I would agree. I would think that you'll see, just as the DNI said, a full spectrum of targets given the information that's out there.
Have, in fact, China's cyber attacks, the amount of them decreased over the last 5 years? Is that a fact?
I would defer to that question to the closed hearing and to the intelligence community.
I would agree with that. I think that would be a ripe subject for the closed hearing. What I can say is in terms of the theft of intellectual property for commercial purposes, as Admiral Rogers said, the jury is still out on that, and I believe the DNI said that too. But with respect to any more detail, we can get that into another setting.
Mr. Singer?
As to the question on the goal of intellectual property theft not just being economic, it definitely has a national security side, and the easy answer to you would be Google images of F-35 and J-31, and you will see a remarkable similarity between our most expensive weapons project and their new jet fighter system. And they either it's coincidentally they look alike or there's something else going on.
What can Congress do to provide additional deterrence to countries like China, as far as maybe criminal law, for example? What more can we do? What are your suggestions? And I'm thinking of China specifically here, but it applies to all nations, obviously. Here's your chance. Here's your chance. Tell us what to do.
I would offer that this is really an issue of strategic reality, incentives, disincentives, and consequences. We've talked about attribution, public attribution, and that there may be no bite behind a bark. I would offer you have to look at very complex bilateral relationships, certainly if you're talking about the United States and China, but also with other countries, and ask what would strategically incentivize or decentivize changes in behavior. Having served 16 years in the intelligence community, for me it was about what was actually happening, not what was being said. And again, to get into the very particulars of that, about volumes of activity or impact of activity, that is again something I would say that the current serving members of the intelligence community and other executive agencies would be better off discussing in a closed session.
I would just add that the fact that in this case, the president and at the highest levels of our government, obviously the president raising this with the president of China as not just an issue of cyber versus cyber, but an issue that affected the overall relationship had a big impact.
And if I have time for one more question, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to ask the panel, has there been any noticeable effect following the Department of Justice 2014 indictment of the PLA officers? Has there been any noticeable effect?
From my observation, that became a strong topic of discussion between U.S. government and Chinese government officials, and I defer to my colleagues who are still in government regarding that. And there were also negative ramifications for certain U.S. companies who had business opportunities in China very quickly curtailed. So it had a economic and business impact on U.S. entities, and it also certainly was a central part of the discussions, of the policy discussions, which are better answered by the policy departments.
Mr. Painter?
And part I defer to my colleagues who are not here from the Department of Justice, but I'd say that, yes, a dialogue we had with the Chinese about de-escalation and norms in cyberspace was suspended. We have now gotten back on another foot on that, which seemed an odd reaction to that. But nevertheless, I think it showed that we were serious, certainly, and that when that combined with the president raising it and the threat of sanctions and other things, I think likely brought the Chinese to the table, but that was more an assessment for others.
Any insights on that, Mr. Hughes?
Again, I would also defer to the intel community for classified assessment and then Department of Justice.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the time I do not have.
I